Okay, so if you want to start, you can just tell us who you are and how long you've lived here and that.
My name is Navez. I've lived in this house off and on all my life. It wasn't our normal residence. It was a weekend house of my parents, who bought it well before I was born. Back in actually 1932 is when they bought it, but they've been coming out here since the 1920s because they were good friends with the people who lived across the street.
Tell the address. Your
land,
address.
pardon?
Your address here.
This is I'm at 223 Pond Street in Hopkinton, and the house that brought my parents here is currently lived in by the Pavletics, but it belonged to a man named Alan, whose daughter Pauline married a man named Davis, who was a close friend of my father's, and my parents came out for the weekend once, and they noticed this abandoned house on this side of the road, and my father was an amateur astronomer and a botanist, and there was no power on the street. It was a nice getaway from Cambridge where they lived, and he asked if he could, use the house. The house was offered to him, and eventually my parents bought the house and all the land on this side of Pond Street, which is 48 acres or something, for the magnificent sum of about $2,500.
When was that?
That was in 1932, actually, in the depths of the Depression.
Yeah.
And my parents had been coming out ever since and started fixing up the place. And
where did your father work? He was...
My father was at Harvard at the time, and he was at the Museum of Comparative Zoology, the MCZ, as was Davis. That's how they knew each other, and they were good friends. And that's how my parents came out. And we've been here off and on ever since, though I lived in either Cambridge or in Milton, or for my professional career I was in the Foreign Service, and I lived overseas most of my life.
And where were you?
In the Far East, and Black Africa, and in Europe, as well as Washington, D.C., of course.
Then what year did you retire?
I retired in '85.
And you've
my heart was always here, so this is where I came back to.
And so you've lived here on Pond Street since '85?
Yeah.
Great, and raised your family here?
Well, I didn't raise a family because I don't have children.
Oh, that's right.
But I moved here, excuse me, with my first wife, who died eventually. And she had a good friend who was an Episcopal minister who used to come and stay with us on her summer trips. And eventually I married the Episcopal priest.
That's great.
And that's how I'm here now with my current wife, Christine.
Congratulations. I wanted to see if we could talk about the story that you told about that farm that was next door or down the street just a bit.
The house in the corner belonged to a family named Aronian. The Aronians are still in the area.
They're Armenian?
They're Armenian in origin. And I guess the man who lived there, I've forgotten his first name if I ever knew it, was was a refugee from the Turkish massacres.
Yes.
in Armenia at the end of World War I. Anyway, he was a very plain, uneducated dirt farmer, nice man, who raised chickens and had some apple trees. And the house used to stand in the corner where the Coolidge house lives now, is located now, and it was moved to its current location
At 199
some point.
Pond.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Anyway, my father was known as Dr. Navez because he had a doctorate. And I remember one fall day, Aronian telephoned my father and said, "Dr. Navez, would you come down? My chickens are dying." And this was a man with very little capital. And my father said, well, I'm not a veterinarian, but I'll be happy to go down and, see what I can, tell you. So my father and I went down to the Aronian's house.
How old were you?
I must have been under 10. I don't remember exactly what year it was. And, but my father was not a humorous man. But when he walked into the area beside the house where there was a gigantic pen for chickens, he burst out laughing, and he could barely control himself from the laughing, because there were chickens with their legs crossed, and there were chickens with their wings spread out. There were chickens trying to walk and not able to walk. I remember one chicken particularly on a rock, and it kept falling off the rock and getting back on it. It was an absolute incredible sight of probably, I remember now 2,000 chickens, but I'd have no idea how many really there were. And my father, hysterical laughter, and the poor man who owned this, who was seeing his capital, being destroyed, absolutely heartbroken to see what happened to his chickens. And my father suggested the first thing to do is to get some chicken wire, which he had, and put a fence around the pile of apple mash that was in the middle of the yard, because he'd been squeezing apples to make cider, and he'd thrown the mash into the chicken yard, and the chickens loved it. The first day they tore into it, and the second day they tore into it. By the fourth or fifth day, this pile was sort of steaming away and fermenting, and we were looking at about 2,000 absolutely drunken chickens. And so my father said, put a fence around it, give them a lot of fresh water.
A couple of aspirins.
And I don't think he suggested aspirin. And that they would probably recover. And Aronian did that, and they did recover. And he was very grateful. And what we got out of it was, what I got out of it anyway, was a boyhood memory of 2,000 drunken chickens, which I'd never seen before and I'd never seen since.
Did they pay you back with eggs at that time, or?
No, not that I remember.
Just
but
to thank you.
I don't think people paid each other for neighborly advice or in those days.
Great.
And it was from the Davises, when the Davises moved to St. Louis for some reason. And Westcott was one of the people who developed Technicolor. He had a laboratory in Belmont, and he lived in Belmont, but he would come out here to Hopkins to get away from people he didn't particularly like. And his great passion in life was the ballistics of archery. How do spears, bows, arrows work, and how do they fly? And he had his whole barn was filled with bows, arrows, spears from all sorts of different cultures. But he had what was called a hunter's brush trail, which was much like a golf course except for archery. And you would walk down a path, and you'd come to a stand, and you would look in some direction, you'd see a target, but you didn't know how far away the target was. You could guess whether it was up or whether it was down, whether you were shooting between trees or through brush or whatever, but you'd shoot at it and you'd make your score. You retrieve your arrows and move on to the next station.
That was through the woods here?
That was through the woods on his side of the street.
His side of Pond Street?
On his side of Pond Street.
What is now the
whole area.
State Forest now?
No, it's not the whole area of State Forest. It's the whole area that are filled with all these houses now.
Oh.
Westcott Drive and Cranberry Cove and all that. And
Did they have competitions or?
they must have had at some point, but I wasn't involved in that, and my father wasn't, so I don't know much about that.
Was that in the early 1900s then, or the mid 1900s?
Well, that was it couldn't have been too early because I remember it. And my memory only goes back to back into the 40s sometime. But
when were you born, Andre? What year?
34. But Westcott didn't want all these people tromping into his house to use the bathrooms. So he had an outhouse, and he noticed that we had an outhouse that we no longer used because my parents had installed plumbing at some point. So he asked, could he have our outhouse? My father had no use for it and said, sure. And Westcott came over with a truck and picked up our outhouse and set it up sort of behind his house, just beyond the area that's flat, right behind the house. And then it worked pretty well. People could use the outhouse rather than ask to go into his house. Then he had an idea, let me get a great big bell. And he mounted a great bell on top of the outhouse and put a rope down through the roof of the outhouse and a very neatly lettered sign saying, please flush after use. So all the people who would come out from town and had never used an outhouse but were using one for the first time would announce their successful completion of what they were doing by the tolling of this very large bell.
That's
and
funny.
and appear rather sheepishly, because I remember a couple of the people I saw come out looked rather embarrassed.
Of course
after a
they
while.
were embarrassed.
Anyway, that was the story for the where our outhouse ended up.
He had a good
And,
sense of humor.
He had a very good sense of humor, and he was an interesting man. He was a good friend of my father's, and we visited them in Belmont, and he had all sorts of peculiar things other than all the bows and arrows that were covered the walls of his barn. He had strange things in the house too.
Weapons?
Weapons and
Just a
I
collector?
can remember one skull in his library and with a German helmet on it. And,
A human skull?
Yes. And a few things like that. Anyway, Westcott was an interesting
I
man.
wonder where that came from.
Yeah.
Was there a story, Andre, of one of the Ionians down the street on Pond Street that when he was shot? Do you know that story?
Yes.
Were you there, or do you know of the story?
Well, I know the story.
What
because,
happened?
Well, the people who lived next door to us, which was Joe Struzula's house most recently, were Armenians. Struzula was third generation of the people who lived there. And I think the original family name was Ohanesian, and they were Armenians. And they had an annual festival or big party or picnic for all their friends once a year in the fall. And people, I guess their friends would come from all over. And most of these people were not country people. And they were plinking away with a .22 without knowing much about weapons or where these bullets could end up. And one of them hit Aronian, the old Aronian, in his yard.
The one with the chickens? The
Yes,
chicken farmer?
and he hit him in the groin and severed an artery.
Oh.
And nobody knew what to do about, applying pressure points or anything of this sort. And so the poor man bled to death. And
When was that, Andre? Do you know?
as a kid, the dates, I was again young.
Probably in the 40s, maybe?
Probably in the 40s, sometime mid-40s, something like that.
And then his family was left without a father?
Pardon?
And the family was left without a father?
I don't remember because we didn't know them that well.
Okay.
We knew them as, neighbors to say hello to and all this. But the story, of course, was that this was an intra-Armenian feud, and that this had been done deliberately, which I don't believe. But that was a story that circulated for a long time.
Really?
And there's no reason to think that was the case.
Do you know what brought Armenians to this area of Hopkinton in the first place? I know a lot of them have settled in Watertown now. I just don't know what the attraction was.
Yeah, no, I don't.
Were there a lot of Armenians in this area?
Well, the only other than the Ohanesians and the Aronians, the only other one I can think of was Boyajian, who lived on Winter Street.
Oh.
But no, I can't think of any particular reason.
Mm.
I mean, the Armenians, I guess, basically have been pretty hard-working immigrants who, worked hard to settle in and make a living for themselves. And I'm not sure whether the first Armenians settled here attracted the second.
That's usually what happens, just
Yeah,
the same with all other neighborhoods.
That's what happens, wherever you start developing a ghetto, whether it's Italian or Jewish or Irish or whatever it happens to be.
Well, what did your father do with this land when he first had it? Did he farm it, or?
Well, he didn't really farm it, but he was a botanist, and he was a plant physiologist, who was studying the structure of plants, which means you don't need 48 acres, which is what we had. You needed, a little plot of ground on which to raise flowers, so that he could study the flowers. And his primary flower was the gladioli, because it had, large cells. Apparently, it was easy to study. And he and a man named Bert Temple, who occasionally worked for us, who lives between Jimmy Pine and the Edelmans now, in that little house set back from the road.
Yep.
Bert Temple also raised flowers. He raised them for beauty. My father raised them for cell structure. But they had a sort of a competition going. And they often shared the same source for the seeds and flowers or corms.
I didn't know that. He's a photographer now, isn't he?
Pardon?
Is he a photographer? It says that on his mailbox.
Bert Temple was an old man when I knew him.
Oh, so maybe it's his son?
He was a farm laborer. His son was named Roland Temple, who was a professional dynamiter, who built the house next to Angel's Nurseries on the same side of the street as Angel's Nurseries, going down towards the lake. And I don't know who else is there.
Oh, I'm thinking of the people that...
There were many temples here. And I can show you a map, that identifies by, a 1909 map, that identifies by name all the houses that were occupied by temples. They were all over the place. Temples was a very large tribe. But I remember Bert Temple because he was a very distinguished looking man, and he and my father would get together and sort of silently talk plants. And
Was your father here full time then? Did your father live here in this house full time?
No, it was always a weekend house or
always for him,
or a vacation house for him.
So you only began living here full time.
I began living here full time when I retired from the Foreign Service.
In '85 or so.
Mm-hmm.
And this is your home ever since?
It's been my home ever since.
It's a beautiful place.
Well, we've added onto it considerably. We added the whole wing over there, and we added upstairs. But the room you're in here now was the entire house when my parents got it. I can show you a photograph of it.
I think I'll move this around and show a little bit.
And,
what year was this house built? The original house?
We don't know exactly why, because it was not built here. It was moved here when Whitehall was dammed at Woodville to make into a lake rather than the 3 ponds that were there.
Oh, yeah.
And the story, quite possibly apocryphal, was that the house was sawed in half, and each half was loaded onto a quarry wagon, and it was being trundled down Pond Street on its way to Upton, where it would have been set up somewhere. But one of the quarry wagons broke down as it was passing this pasture, and so it was pushed into the nearest cow pasture, and the other part was pushed in and it was just stuck back on, and the house has been here ever since. And which, if you look at how it was, how the house was built and everything else, it's and the basement particularly, you can believe it.
It makes sense once you look at it.
Yes.
So it wasn't supposed to be here. It was supposed to go further, but they got tired of.
It wasn't supposed to be here, but it is, and.
It's a nice spot. Andre, if you don't mind, could you tell the story about what you've done with the land here? That you've donated some.
Well, some years back, I decided that I wanted to protect this land, because this land is where my heart has always been. Whenever I was overseas, I always dreamed about coming back, and I did on vacations and holidays when I could. And I wanted to see it protected, and I didn't want to see it destroyed. And when I first retired and moved here, I was getting at least one call a week from some developer who wanted to slice off an acre here or 2 acres there, and including one who came in with a proposal that they could make a road between Pond Street and Spring Street, where Snowy Owl Drive is now, and they could pack in 17 houses. And
was that back in the 1980s, early 90s?
That was 1980s, during the housing boom.
Yeah.
And that was such an anathema to me. This is land that I've loved, and I still love, that I thought that in order to protect it, the thing to do was to donate it to the state. And so we did it in 2 parts. The first 42 acres we donated to the state as a wildlife sanctuary. It took an inordinate amount of time to do, I must say. State bureaucracy at that time was absolutely paralyzed. And
when was that?
this was back in the, must have been the late 80s. And, but anyway, we finally managed to give that, and we'd carved out 5 or 6 acres around the house. And I decided that some years later that those 5 or 6 acres were a menace to be developed. And then my cow pasture, my 2 or 3 fields and vegetable garden and orchard, could blossom forth with houses. Mm-hmm. And I didn't want to see that happen. So we gave the Sudbury Valley trustees an easement on the remaining land that we have, which permits repairs in the house, permits the house to be fixed and changed as necessary. The barn can be replaced or fixed, and the land can be used agriculturally in any number of different ways, but it would always have to be agricultural. And so I managed to accomplish that last fall. And so the land is protected. And the land that my parents got for $2,500 back in 1932 will never be developed.
All of it, it's 48 acres or so?
It was a bit over 48 acres, but some of it we wanted to have as a wildlife sanctuary, because I'm not opposed to hunting, but there is hunting in the Upton State Forest we abut, and I keep finding, I kept finding all sorts of hunters, tromping around, blasting away at things. So I wanted to make sure that they weren't that close to the house.
Sure.
So we did it as a wildlife sanctuary. And
is it marked that way then,
no,
the boundary of it? Does your land, or the land that you've donated, does it run mostly along Pond Street, or does it run back away from Pond Street?
It's trumpet shaped. There's a fair amount along Pond Street, and it runs back into the state forest, into the
Upton State Forest.
It's a wedge-shaped piece of land with a fair amount on Pond Street, and it goes down. It extends below the Alessio's house in the bend in Pond Street.
And now you keep your sheep, and let's talk a little bit about how you use the land now.
Well, we have fields. I cut my own firewood. We have 4 fields. I run sheep on them. They're pretty scruffy fields, but the sheep seem to like them. At least the breed of sheep we have, Scottish Blackface. The advantage of Scottish Blackface is several-fold. One, my wife is Scottish. She wanted Scottish Blackface. It's what she was used to. Secondly, they come with handles because they all have horns, male and female. We don't have any rams at the moment. And they're used to eating poor vegetation. So our sheep are not standing belly deep in clover. They're eating, what they find that grows in the fields.
Do they need to be sheared every year, or?
They're sheared every year by a man who lives near Quabbin, and who comes regularly and shears them.
And you also keep chickens?
We also have, chickens which stay in at this time of year, and they go out in a pen as soon as the weather is clement enough to permit it.
And you grow some things.
We have a vegetable garden, which we have an orchard.
Apples?
But these are things basically to keep me busy and out of trouble. and it gives me good exercise. And,
Sure.
And I enjoy working the land.
Understood.
Yeah.
That's hard to see. Andre, if you could talk a little bit about how this area in Hopkinton has changed since you first started coming here.
Well, I think the first thing that changed was we got power on the street, because when I first, it came out with my parents, we had a complete set of kerosene lanterns.
Really?
Because there was no power. And then, I think a petition was eventually drawn up by some neighbors to ask, the power company to put in power. And I can remember the people who lived where the Alessios live now. His name was Stanger, and he was the head engineer for the Christian Science Monitor. And he had his own generator, so he wasn't terribly enthused to have power on the street, because he didn't need it. He had power.
When was that? Would that have been in the 40s, or when power?
Again, I don't remember, because I can remember when we had kerosene lanterns everywhere. But again, it must have been during the war or something like that. Right after the war, the power came.
World War II.
And then the next major development was that the street was paved, because you could hear cars coming, and there are only half a dozen a day that used Pond Street, but one of them was by the mailman Joe Norton, who drove like a bat out of hell. And you could hear the stones bouncing off the inside of his fenders a long way off, and you knew it was Joe coming with the mail. and anyway, the street was eventually paved, and you can tell how much a street is used by the marks on it. And if the street has a single line down the middle of it, it's not used very much, because people are driving in the middle of the street. But if you look at the street now, you'll see that people drive on the right-hand side of the street, and so you'll see 2 lines, which is the middle part of the car. It shows you how much traffic there is now. And I think the next thing that really developed was that people started driving after the war as Sunday drivers. They would just get into their cars and find street and just go slowly up and down looking at things. You don't see that anymore.
Yeah.
But Sunday drivers was, a major occupation, what people did right after the war, when gas was cheap and they had cars. And,
Just pile the whole family in and take a drive?
yeah, take the family
We
out
used
for a
to do
drive,
that.
probably end up for an ice cream somewhere.
Yep.
And and then of course the next thing that happened is people started building houses. And there aren't too many developments in this area, but there are some. And water was eventually brought in, which meant that they could have smaller lot sizes, because before that you needed, a certain minimum amount of space to separate your septic system from your well.
Oh, yeah.
And that was set by the state as far as what was the appropriate distance and what was the lot size. I think we're still a 2-acre lot size here.
Minimum?
Minimum.
I'm not sure.
But water has come down the street, and we haven't tapped into it because we don't need to. We have our own water.
Still on the
And
well?
a lot of the houses, still use their own water.
I'm sure when you first came here with your parents, there was no I-90, no I-495.
Oh, no, not at all.
So those are new developments.
Pardon?
Those are relatively new developments, I
Oh,
suppose.
Yeah. And, there was a fox farm. There was a farm wiped out by 495, and it raised foxes.
Really?
There was an old house and a lot of cages, and they raised foxes for fur.
Really? Right by where 495 and the Pike are?
I think it's probably right under where 495 is now, because instead of coming, we used to come on, a bit hard to describe it, you have to see it on an old map, but we come in a different way now than we did then, at least at the beginning.
Have you seen the town change, the downtown area?
The downtown area hasn't changed in all that much. It's gotten, it's quadrupled in size as far as the number of people. There are obvious changes, for instance, what you find at Collella's. Collella's started as a sort of a very basic store for flour, sugar, bread, and a few things like this. And I can remember the first time I was in Collella's and I saw mandarin orange slices. And this was something absolutely unheard of in the early days of Collella's.
Fresh fruit, fresh produce?
Yes. And actually they were canned, but the fact that it was worth their while to carry mandarin orange slices meant that somebody would buy them. So that began to show the change in the nature of the people living here. And I think I draw a distinction now between what I would consider the old house people and the new house people. The people who live in a development in a new house of the sort that we don't need to point out, they're all over the place, have very little interest in the town as such. They have an interest in maintaining their property value because when they're transferred in 7 years to Atlanta or Silicon Valley or somewhere, they want to get their money back out. While the people who live in the old farmhouses are people who, in most cases, plan to live here, the rest of their lives, or at least they plan to live here.
For some time.
And they participate in town.
That's an interesting observation. I think it's probably accurate.
And you can tell who the old house people are and who the new house people are. Not always. I mean, let's not get carried away and say this is hard and fast, because there are people who live in new houses that participate fully in town.
It seems that there are certain areas of town that are delineated. In this area here on Pond Street, it's mainly older houses. Hayden Row is mainly older houses.
Yeah.
The newer developments they seem to be in pockets in
Yeah.
some areas, and then they're in whole areas of other parts.
Yeah.
So it is delineated that way. Can you think of other changes that you've seen over the time that you've known Hopkinton, and traditions like the marathon? Has that evolved?
Well, the marathon used to start at Lucky Rock and no longer starts at Lucky Rock, which is the flat rock, opposite where Roger Mezzo used to live.
Where's that? What street is that on?
It's on 135.
Okay.
Just, the marathon committee keeps adjusting the length depending on how streets have been straightened. So they have to move back and forth. The start line is moved up to the center of town now.
Right.
But it used to start much lower down. It's obviously a much bigger thing now than it used to be. People used to run with office shoes and
the whole marathon?
yeah, because they didn't have sporting gear was not that common. And what else can I tell you about the marathon? It's always been there. It's certainly going down to 2 or 3 houses beyond the start of the marathon is where a lot of people, right after the marathon crowd has gone by, rush out onto the street and pick up all the discarded clothing, because people running in the marathon wear clothes to keep warm, and then they have old clothes and they just discard them on the side of the street. And if you race out, you can pick up all sorts of stuff, clean it, and donate it to charity.
Oh, I see.
So you get bales of clothing that way.
I never thought of that.
And though Colors also sells, plastic bags that people can cut and make into ponchos in case it
If
rains.
it's raining.
What else can I? It's,
Well,
I think one of the strengths of the town has always been the library, which is a very good library and has been very well run for a long time. And that's one of the really attractions of the town, I think.
it's a beautiful building.
Well, it used to be the Episcopal Church,
Did it?
and which is now down on I guess it's on 135 further on.
Did you ever participate in the town government in any way, on any committee?
Oh, yeah, I spent many years in Conservation Commission and ad hoc committees of this and that and one thing and the other. And,
Can you remember any particular battles that stand out in your mind about with the Conservation Committee?
Well, sometimes things were a bit, but basically the town was run you could disagree with people, you could have a personal feud with somebody, but things were run on a reasonably decent basis. In a small town, there are always people who don't speak to other people for various reasons. I can think of one pair of people who argued about absolutely everything, and their last argument was which one of them lived on the curliest street. Yeah, I'm not sure what reason this had.
Why it matters.
What it mattered, but that was their last large vocal argument.
Well, from what I've heard, that in the times past and maybe now as well, people could disagree vehemently in town meetings and yet still go home and be quite civil as neighbors.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. It depended also on who the town moderator was, because the town moderator has to maintain a grasp over over this sort of thing, and
Order.
and expel people if they don't follow the town moderator's instructions. And of course, you always have to have police there to carry out the people who object. But you had characters too, Pratt, for instance, Mary Pratt's former husband, never needed a microphone because he was so loud and always sat in the very back of the hall. And he always had something to say, but unfortunately it was usually 2 or 3 articles ahead or behind what we were actually talking about. And there were, a few others. They were characters.
So your mother and father both were here in this house? Both your parents, and did they die here, or?
Oh, they didn't die here. No, they lived in Milton.
So this was
this was their weekend house and their getaway. And
Are you an only child?
Yeah, I'm an only child.
Okay, so this came to you then.
So it came to me, and
Nice.
but this is where my heart was always. It's where I learned my love of the outdoors.
I can understand.
Yeah.
We're trying